country track. And I didn't think once he'd be sending me a country track. I thought it'd be pop rock.
Sure.
I
felt we were big rivals. You know, we were the Beatles. They were the Rolling Stones.
Do you feel that
Ringo Starr has always been known for his straightforward approach to communication. He never used more words than necessary and always spoke his mind directly. While the other members of the Beatles spent time discussing deep philosophical ideas about art and the meaning of their music, Ringo simply focused on playing his drums and being honest about what he thought. This straightforward nature extended to his opinions about music, and when he disliked something, he had no problem saying so clearly. Throughout his career, Ringo has been remembered by most people as the funny member of the Beatles, the one who was easygoing and relaxed. He sang memorable songs and made people laugh during interviews and public appearances. However, underneath this charming and friendly exterior was a deeply serious musician who had strong opinions about what made music good or bad. He understood instinctively what worked in a song and what did not work, and he was never shy about criticizing albums that he felt missed the mark, even when those same albums were considered masterpieces by critics and fans around the world. The albums that Ringo disliked were not just random records that failed to appeal to his personal taste. Instead, they represented broader problems that he saw throughout rock music during his era. He felt that too many bands were overproducing their music, adding unnecessary layers of complexity and studio effects. He believed that some artists were being pretentious, trying too hard to seem intellectual or artistic, rather than focusing on making good music. He saw musicians losing the essential groove and rhythm that made rock music work, sacrificing it for the sake of appearing clever or innovative. And he felt that many artists were taking themselves too seriously, forgetting that music should ultimately be enjoyable. As a drummer, Ringo built his entire reputation on feel and pocket. He understood that the drummer's job was to create a solid foundation for the song, to establish a groove that listeners could connect with physically and emotionally. When albums violated these principles, when they prioritized technical complexity over feeling, or buried the rhythm section under excessive production, Ringo saw these as serious musical mistakes that he could not overlook or forgive. He never apologized for having these strong opinions, and he never pretended to like something just because it was popular or critically acclaimed. One of the major albums that Ringo strongly disliked was Brain Salad Surgery by Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which was released in 1973. Progressive rock as a genre and Ringo Starr as a musician were never going to be compatible, and this particular album represented everything that frustrated him about progressive rock. The album featured extremely long songs that stretched to 20 minutes or more, classical music adaptations that seemed forced, and synthesizers that were trying to replicate the sound of full orchestras. Keith Emerson's keyboard playing was technically impressive, with his fingers flying rapidly across multiple keyboards, but in the process of showcasing this technical skill, the fundamental groove that makes music danceable and enjoyable completely disappeared. The album opened with a version of Jerusalem, which was originally a classical piece that the band had stretched and transformed into rock opera territory. Following that came other extended tracks, including one epic song that lasted half an hour. While the technical ability on display was absolutely impressive and perhaps worthy of respect, the music was not something that anyone could easily dance to or even tap their foot along with. Ringo once expressed in an interview that he simply did not understand music that you could not tap your foot to, questioning what the point of such music could be. For someone like Ringo, who believed deeply that a drummer's primary job was to serve the song and make it work, Brain Salad Surgery felt like pure musical self-indulgence. Carl Palmer's drum solos throughout the album were technically perfect and demonstrated incredible skill, but they felt emotionally cold and disconnected. The rhythms constantly shifted and changed, making it impossible for a listener to find a comfortable pocket and settle into it. Everything about the album seemed designed to show off the musicians' technical abilities and prove how many different time signatures they could incorporate into a single song. Ringo came from a completely different school of musical thinking. The Beatles certainly wrote complex and innovative music, but their songs always had genuine heart and emotion at their core. A song like A Day in the Life was highly experimental and pushed boundaries, but it still made listeners feel something real and deep. Brain salad surgery might make you think and might even impress you with its technical prowess, but it did not make you want to move your body or feel anything emotionally. For Ringo, this was the worst sin that music could commit. In his view, music without soul was simply noise that happened to have a diploma from a music school. He never bought into the hype surrounding progressive rock, and he never pretended to appreciate it. Another album that disappointed Ringo was The Soft Parade by The Doors, released in 1969. Ringo genuinely loved the early work of The Doors. Songs like Light My Fire had a strong groove, and Break On Through had real energy and excitement. However, The Soft Parade felt like a betrayal of everything that had made The Doors dangerous and exciting in the first place. Suddenly, the band's sound included horns and string sections and a level of studio polish that seemed completely unnecessary. Jim Morrison's raw, powerful poetry got buried underneath multiple layers of orchestration that nobody had asked for and that did not serve the songs. The title track of the album stretched over 8 minutes, but it wandered without any clear purpose or direction. Brass sections appeared randomly throughout the song without any logical reason for being there. The overall production seemed designed to make The Doors sound like a sophisticated lounge act rather than the edgy rock band they had been. The song Touch Me became a commercial hit, but it felt manufactured and calculated rather than genuine. Where was the darkness that had made The Doors special? Where was the dangerous edge that had made them exciting? Ringo later commented that the band had taken a group that originally sounded like they were playing in a garage and made them sound like they belonged in a hotel lobby.
What frustrated Ringo most about The Soft Parade was how the drums were treated in the mix. John Densmore was a genuinely talented jazz drummer with excellent feel and instincts, but on this album, his drums got completely drowned out by all the other instruments and arrangements. The mixing pushed the drums back in the soundscape, letting the orchestral arrangements take over the sonic space. For Ringo, who had fought repeatedly with producer George Martin to keep his drums prominent in Beatles recordings, this felt like musical cowardice. He believed strongly that the rhythm section was the foundation of any rock song, and you should never bury it underneath violins and horns. The Doors were clearly trying to gain legitimacy with this album, trying to prove that they were more than just a psychedelic bar band. But in their pursuit of respectability and mainstream acceptance, they lost the danger and edge that had made them special in the first place. Morrison's lyrics on the album about Native Americans and political chaos felt forced and intellectual rather than felt and genuine. Ringo preferred the raw 3-minute version of Morrison who screamed with passion rather than the version who tried to philosophize. The Soft Parade was the Doors wearing a suit and tie, and Ringo absolutely hated seeing suits in rock and roll. If brain salad surgery annoyed Ringo, then Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes absolutely enraged him. This double album was released in 1973 and featured only 4 songs total. Each of these 4 songs stretched past 18 minutes in length. The concept behind the album was supposedly based on Hindu scriptures and ancient spiritual texts. The musicianship throughout was absolutely flawless from a technical standpoint, but the groove was completely and utterly absent. Yes had always been a technical band, but this album took things way too far in that direction. Rick Wakeman played 10 different keyboards simultaneously. Throughout the album, Steve Howe's guitar playing spiraled off into jazz fusion territory that seemed disconnected from rock music. The rhythms changed every 30 seconds or so, never allowing the listener to settle into any comfortable pattern. Chris Squire's bass playing was impressive on a technical level, but it never sat still enough to let the listener breathe and absorb what was happening. Ringo once told a journalist that he had listened to 20 minutes of the album and still could not figure out where the downbeat was supposed to be, where the one was in any given measure. For a drummer whose entire musical philosophy was built on the foundation of solid, reliable timekeeping, this album represented pure chaos. Alan White was the drummer on the album, and while he was certainly a great drummer, even his talents could not save songs that fundamentally refused to settle into any kind of groove. One song went on for 22 minutes without ever giving the listener anything solid to hold on to. The experience was impressive in the same way that watching someone solve a Rubik's Cube while blindfolded might be impressive. It demonstrated amazing technical skill, but it was emotionally empty and did not connect with listeners on a human level. Ringo firmly believed that music should connect with people, not confuse them. The Beatles had made both Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and The White House, both of which were highly experimental and ambitious. But even at their weirdest and most experimental moments, the Beatles never forgot that there were actual listeners on the other end who needed to be considered. Tales from Topographic Oceans felt like Yes had completely forgotten that anyone was listening at all. It was music made for musicians, by musicians, about music theory itself. Ringo wanted absolutely nothing to do with that approach. Give him a solid backbeat and a clear melody, and that was all rock and roll had ever needed in his view. The fourth album on Ringo's list of most hated records was The Wall by Pink Floyd, released in 1979. This choice surprised many people because Pink Floyd were generally considered untouchable by critics and fans alike. The Wall was widely hailed as a masterpiece, an ambitious rock opera exploring themes of isolation, fame, and madness. Roger Waters had poured his heart and soul into creating it, and the production quality was absolutely immaculate. Despite all of this, Ringo Starr thought the album was miserable, overblown, and emotionally exhausting in the worst possible way. Ringo's problem was not with the concept behind the album. He understood darkness and difficult emotions perfectly well. He had lived through Beatlemania and all its pressures, and he had watched John Lennon spiral into various personal problems. But The Wall did not simply explore pain and darkness. Instead, it wallowed in these negative emotions. The album contained 26 songs filled with anger, self-pity, and blame. While Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 became a massive commercial hit, the rest of the album felt like sitting through someone's therapy session that nobody had asked to attend. The drum sound on The Wall was stiff and programmed sounding, completely lifeless. There was no swing to the rhythms, no natural feel, just cold precision and mechanical accuracy. For a drummer whose entire musical philosophy was built on the foundation of solid, reliable timekeeping, this album represented pure chaos. Alan White was the drummer on the album, and while he was certainly a great drummer, even his talents could not save songs that fundamentally refused to settle into any kind of groove. One song went on for 22 minutes without ever giving the listener anything solid to hold on to. The experience was impressive in the same way that watching someone solve a Rubik's Cube while blindfolded might be impressive. It demonstrated amazing technical skill, but it was emotionally empty and did not connect with listeners on a human level. Ringo firmly believed that music should make you feel better, not worse. The Wall was 2 full hours of feeling worse. It was certainly important and definitely ambitious, but it was not fun in any way. It was not joyful. And for Ringo, who had sung songs like Octopus's Garden and With a Little Help from My Friends, joy mattered tremendously in music. Rock and roll was supposed to lift you up and make you feel better, even when it dealt with dark subject matter. The Wall simply dragged you down emotionally and left you there without any relief or hope. White Light and White Heat by the Velvet Underground was another album that Ringo strongly disliked. The Velvet Underground were considered extremely cool and influential by critics and other musicians. Everyone said so repeatedly. Critics worshipped their work, and countless bands cited them as major influences on their own music. But when Ringo Starr listened to White Light and White Heat in 1968, he heard nothing except noise, and not even the good kind of noise that could be exciting, just pure chaos without any purpose, feedback without melody, and aggression without any groove to anchor it.
The title track assaulted the listener's ears for just under 3 minutes, which Ringo considered merciful given how unpleasant it was. But then the album included Sister Ray, which was 17 minutes of the same 3 chords repeated endlessly, with out-of-tune guitars and Lou Reed talk-singing about drugs and depravity. John Cale's organ playing sounded like a wounded animal screaming. The drums bashed away without any discernible rhythm or pattern. The album was not experimental in any meaningful sense. It simply sounded unfinished and sloppy. Ringo genuinely appreciated raw, rough music. The Beatles had started their career in Hamburg playing dirty, straightforward rock and roll in clubs, but even at their roughest and least polished, the Beatles always had actual songs with melodies and structures. White Light, White Heat felt like a band that had simply given up on songwriting entirely and then called the result art. The production was deliberately terrible, seemingly as a stylistic choice. The mixing buried everything under layers of distortion, and worst of all from Ringo's perspective, there was no clear backbeat that a listener could follow. For Ringo, drumming fundamentally meant keeping time and creating a solid pocket for all the other musicians to live inside. Maureen Tucker played drums standing up, hitting floor toms with mallets, which was an unusual approach. Minimalist drumming could certainly work well in the right context, but in this case, it just sounded confused and aimless. Ringo later joked that he'd heard better rhythm at a busy train station. The Velvet Underground went on to influence punk rock, experimental rock, and alternative music, which was fine, but Ringo never understood why anyone would deliberately want to sound that bad on purpose. Trout Mask Replica by Captain Beefheart was another album that critics often called genius, but that Ringo absolutely hated. Released in 1969, it contained 28 tracks of avant-garde insanity. Captain Beefheart growled and barked over rhythms that seemed completely random. Multiple guitars played what sounded like different songs simultaneously. Time signatures collapsed in on themselves, and Ringo Starr hated every single second of the listening experience. In Ringo's opinion, this was not music at all. It was an endurance test designed to see how much chaos a listener could tolerate. Songs sounded like 5 different bands playing in 5 different rooms while someone recorded the result through a wall. The drumming was intentionally off-time and wrong-sounding. The bass and guitar never seemed to agree on what musical key they were supposed to be playing in. Beefheart's vocals sounded like a man yelling angrily at furniture. Ringo genuinely tried to give the album a fair chance. He believed in approaching every album with an open mind. But after 10 minutes of listening to Trout Mask Replica, he had to turn it off. He later told friends that life was simply too short to pretend you liked something that sounded like a mistake. And that was exactly what this album was in Ringo's view. It was a mistake that had somehow gotten pressed onto vinyl records and then called revolutionary by critics who wanted to seem sophisticated. The musicians on the album were apparently very talented individuals who had been forced to learn incredibly complex parts. But complexity was not the same thing as quality. You could make something extremely difficult to play that was still completely unlistenable. Ringo had proven throughout his career that you could play relatively simple parts and still be legendary. His drum part on Come Together was just a basic groove, but it was absolutely perfect for the song. Beefheart proved that you could play incredibly complicated parts and still bore people to tears. Ringo had chosen simplicity and soul. Beefheart had chosen chaos and pretension. Finally, at the very top of Ringo's list of most hated albums was Metal Machine Music by Lou Reed, released in 1975. This was not even music in any conventional sense. It was 64 minutes of pure guitar feedback. There were no drums anywhere on the album, no vocals, no melody, no rhythm, just 4 sides of screeching, howling electronic noise. Lou Reed claimed that it was art and an important statement. Ringo called it a joke that had gone way too far. Reed had certainly made great albums in the past. Transformer was brilliant, and Berlin was dark but genuine and real. But Metal Machine Music felt like Reed was deliberately flipping off his record label and his fans at the same time. Music stores actually accepted the album as a return after customers complained about being tricked into buying it. Critics were sharply divided between calling it genius and calling it complete garbage. Ringo did not hesitate at all in his judgment. It was garbage, plain and simple. There was absolutely nothing for a listener to latch on to. No beat to follow along with, no song to hum or remember, just endless abrasive noise that gave you a headache. Ringo certainly believed in experimentation and pushing boundaries. The Beatles had made Revolution 9, which was weird and abstract and challenging, but even that experimental track had texture, variation, and some kind of artistic purpose behind it. Metal Machine Music was just one continuous note screaming for an entire hour. Ringo later said in an interview that if metal machine music represented the future of rock and roll, then he wanted to be counted out completely. He genuinely meant it. For a man who had dedicated his entire life to rhythm, groove, and making people feel good through music, metal machine music represented the complete opposite of everything that music should be. It was selfish, hostile, and worst of all, it was boring despite being loud and aggressive. Lou Reed wanted to make an anti-album that rejected all conventional ideas about music. He had succeeded in that goal, and Ringo Starr wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. Ringo believed that some things in art are genuinely ahead of their time and only get appreciated later, but other things are simply mistakes that should be recognized as mistakes. In his view, metal machine music was clearly a mistake. Throughout his entire career, Ringo never pretended to like things that he genuinely did not like. From progressive rock excess to avant-garde noise experiments, these 7 albums represented everything he thought was fundamentally wrong with rock music during his era. They were too clever for their own good, too cold and emotionless, and too far removed from the basic beat and groove that made rock and roll work. His musical tastes remained simple, honest, and firmly rooted in the importance of groove and feel. He valued music that made people feel good and want to move, and he had no patience for music that seemed designed to confuse, alienate, or impress, rather than connect with listeners on a human level.